Chapter 18 of History of Japan in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sweta, Toronto, April 2023. History of Japan in Words of One Syllable by Helen Ainslie Smith. Chapter 18 The War with China. From this time, Japan grew in all kinds of ways. Railroads were built, and those who go to see that land now can go in the cars through the length and breadth of it. To be sure, the small gigs called jinrikishas are still in use, just as there are folks here who like to ride in their own carriages more than in cars. Lines of wire to send news over have been put up. In some parts of the land, the folk have not been taught what a good thing it was for them to have railroads and lines of wire by which news could go so fast. They thought the old way the best, and fought those who came to lay them out. But in time all saw that these were great things, and they were glad to have them. The Japanese have such shrewd good sense, it does not take them long to know what a thing is worth. They were quick to copy all that was good from the West. They sent their boys to England and America to be taught in schools. Newspapers were started which told all the news, or at times found fault with men or things in such a free way that their head men were put in jail. They do not often get in jail now, though they are still free of speech. Japan grew in wealth too. Its mines were worked and fleets were built. But no one knew how strong the land was, nor how wise and brave its men, till the war with China. What started this war was the state of things in Korea, a land so near that Japan felt called on to ask that the king there should be more just in his rule, so that the Japanese there might be safe. First of all, Japan asked China to join with her in a scheme to better things in Korea if the king would not act. China said she would do it, and so she was bound not to send troops into Korea if she did not first let Japan know. But it was found out in Japan that China had gone to work to fit out ships, and had called out men to go in them to Korea. At this breach of faith, Japan too got ships and men, and let China know that she now would take her own course in Korea. In spite of this, China sent ships and troops to Korea, and a Chinese ship fired a bomb at a Japanese ship near the Korean coast and tried to sink it. This the Japanese took as a cause of war, and they called out to that ship to heave to, but the head man said they would not. Then the Japanese sent a great fire from their guns, and the Chinese ship went down. Her crew were picked up out of the water. In the meantime, some more Chinese ships had landed men, and they had a small fight with some Japanese that were near, and so the war started. It is a strange fact that in this, as in each fight of the war, the Japanese beat the Chinese. The next fight was at Pyongyang 6 weeks from that time. There the Chinese had marched their troops, and the Japanese brought theirs from the sea. There was a host of men on each side, but the Chinese troops that were there were all but wiped out. That was the last fight on Korean soil. The Chinese made no stand till they crossed the Yalu stream to Manchuria, and Marshal Yamagata, who had shown that he was a wise and brave man, led the Japanese troops and once more won the day. About the same time, the ships of the Japanese met the ships of China at the mouth of the Yalu and beat them. Admiral Ito was so quick, his ships had such speed, the guns were fired so fast, that the Chinese were whipped at all points. the Japanese ships just whirled round one half of the Chinese line and fired as they went. Then they turned and went round the rear and poured out shot and shell as they went by. Admiral Tiang could bring but half his guns to bear on the foe. At last the Chinese fleet fled to Port Arthur. This fight caused great loss to China, as 5 of her ships were sunk or burned. On land the fight went on. The Japanese took one of China's chief towns, called Feng Wang Ching. Then they took up their posts at a place where there was a gorge with 3 sides shielded by great peaks. This was a spot that gave them a strong base for a fight. Then part of them marched to a point due west, which was quite as good, the small walled town of Haicheng, and the third part took up their place near the coast. It was some time ere the Chinese troops marched on them from the far-off banks of the Amur, and then it was seen how wise they had been to take up such strong points. For the troops that came were the best of the ranks of China, but the Japanese stood their ground, and the forces hurled at them were routed as they came. The Japanese kept a strict watch all along their line, and they did not once show that they had held the foe too cheap. The Chinese, it may be, knew this, for they tried but once to break the line. The soldiers of Manchuria had been thought to be very brave, full of zeal, as they dashed off on their fine steeds and strong to bear the ills of war. But this was not found to be the case. From the start they seemed to take the first chance to fly, and at their best their aim was poor. When hemmed in by Japanese, they fought fiercely, but lacked the nerve to use their guns in the best way. The Japanese next took New Chuang, a place of trade, where men from all lands lived. They were told that they should be safe there, and in fact they were far more safe when guarded by the Japanese than they had been in the care of the wild hordes from Hunan. These fled at the first sight of the Mikado's men. Marshal Yamagata's health broke down at this time, and he was forced to go home. Port Arthur was a place that the Japanese wished to take, as it was known that there were large war stores there, so a large force of men were sent out to take this fort. Great care was taken and not left to chance. The boats that held the troops had warships to guard them, lest the Chinese ships should come out of hiding and pounce on them. But they need not have feared, for the Chinese admiral had moved far out of reach and was snug in a good port where he could not be seen. He did not try to keep Port Arthur or raise a hand to save it, though vast sums had been spent on it, and it had been thought no foe could take it. So Count Oyama, who led this part of the army of Japan, had a clear field. The troops all landed safe some miles from the port, and then the great siege guns were brought on shore. The men marched by land, and no one tried to stop them, save at a place halfway. There the Chinese had built forts and armed them with Krupp guns, but they were fired only once, and then the men fled to Port Arthur. All the guns, and the plans of their place, and the way that they had meant to hold it, all fell in the hands of the foe. So the Japanese took all, and the spoils were worth a great deal. The next great task was to take Port Arthur. Those who had fled there to be safe added, of course, to those who were to be fed, but a large part got out of the way ere the fight started. They got off to the sea by means of a small bay at the rear of the fort called Pigeon Bay. When the Japanese came, there were not more than a third left of those who till a late date had been camped in the lines. The fall of Port Arthur gave to the Japanese 80 guns, most of them Krupps, and all that was needed to fire them. Large lots of grain and food of all kinds fell into their hands, and 2 small steamers that were in dock at the time. To take this place was a grand stroke for the Japanese, for it was full of all that wealth could buy, and was at a point on the sea which was of great use for their fleets. Port Arthur had a whole line of forts, and it took time to bring the great siege guns over the land. Ridges had to be climbed, brush cut, and trees felled, and roads had to be made. As the Japanese drew near, a small band dashed out from one of the forts and made out to seize some of the Japanese. These they killed as they fled back, and left their bodies all cut and slashed in a vile way close to the track. When the main part of the troops saw this, they were wild with rage, and they killed all they found with arms in their hands. They were fired on from the houses and had to make strict laws to keep such things down. Some thought the Japanese were more harsh than they should have been, but war does not make men mild or sweet. It is well known that they took as good care of the Chinese wounded as they did of their own men. There is no room for doubt to those who have watched Japan in her growth that she has been as strict as any land in her mode of war, and as kind to the foe. Prince Arisugamo, the uncle of the Mikado, was the head man of the whole Japanese army in this war. He took cold when Port Arthur was seized, but he thought he could not be spared. So he went on with his work, though quite ill. He was a great and brave man, as he had shown in many fights. He grew worse, and his brain was filled with thoughts of the war. The scenes through which he had passed were round him all the time, and he thought he was at the head of the troops. But at last the war drums ceased to throb in his brain, and the flags were furled. Peace had come to him. All mourned his loss, and he was laid in his grave with all the pomp they could give him. The next great move was to send a large force of troops by boats to the town of Yongchang. From thence they marched over a rough road to a place called Weihaiwei, which the Chinese had made strong with forts. More troops, led by Admiral Ito, guarded the way to the sea, and at last the Japanese had their force on all sides. There were 2 Chinese ironclad ships and some boats in the bay. The small isles had been made strong, and on each of the hills great guns had been fixed. All that could be done to add to the strength of the works had been done, and the Chinese had a right to feel proud of the place. Their guns were of the new kind, and they had great stores of shot and powder. They had food laid up for some time, and all that was needed was men with some pluck to keep the foe at bay for a long time. To tell the truth, the Chinese did fight better here than they had done, but as the Japanese took the forts, they turned on the Chinese their own guns. With the guns on the hill, they fired on Admiral Tiang's fleet in the bay. For 2 days the fight went on, but at last the Chinese on land fled to the south. All this time, Admiral Tiang had not tried to get out of the toils. The foe lay outside, but his ships were larger and stronger than those of Japan. They might have cut their way through, but they did not try to do so. They lay there while the guns on the hills fired on them night and day. They fired back, to be sure, but that was all. At last the Japanese admiral let 3 of his torpedo boats start out one night when the moon had set. They steamed straight for the ironclads and launched their torpedoes right in the face of the fire sent out by the Chinese. These boats came back with some of their brave men killed, but they had sunk one of the Chinese warships and hurt one so that it could not be used. The next night they did more harm, for they sunk 3 boats and smashed one ironclad till it was not fit to use. It was such a cold night that 3 of the brave Japanese froze to death at their posts as they came back from the fight. With the loss of all these boats, the last hope of the Chinese had flown. Admiral Tiang and 3 of his head men took their own lives, and the rest of the fleet gave up to the Japanese. They at once gave the Chinese a ship to take the dead admiral and his men back to their homes, and they put their flags at half-mast and fired guns as the boat passed through their lines. Thus the Chinese fleet and her stores fell into the hands of the foe. There was wild grief at the loss, but as great a loss was the man who had shown so much pluck when things were at their worst. The cause of China was now lost, and there was naught to do but to sue for peace. On the 19th of March, Li Hongchang, one of China's greatest men, reached Japan to make terms of peace. Some of the best men of Japan were sent to meet him. A shot was fired on the aged Chinese by a Soshi, who was so silly as to think he had done a great thing. The emperor and empress felt great pain at this mad act, and they took care that all should be done to bring back health to their guest. In the meantime, the Japanese troops had gone to Formosa, and that place was taken to be held till peace came. China did not wish to pay as much for the war as Japan asked, but at last peace was signed for a great sum. In all places where the Japanese rule had been held, railroads have been built, schools started, and the folks taught the best modes of life. In Formosa, the soil is good, and there are coal fields which will be worked in the best way. Tea grows well, too, in some places, and the Japanese have the hillsides set out with the shrub. Sugar, too, can be raised, and hemp and jute. The seas are stocked with fish, and the woods with game of all kinds. There are ducks, geese, snipe, deer, boars, wild goats, bears, and wild cats. The men of Formosa are wild and fond of fights. They go in clans and war with each other, but they do not lack sense, and show that they can be trained. The silk goods sent out from Japan is a great source of wealth. Coal is cheap and wages low, so that Japan can sell her silk cheaper than other lands. Glass is made at Osaka. Boots and clothes of all kinds are made, while the copper and bronze and lacquered goods of Japan are famed in all the world. There is a drug much in use in China which does great harm, and some think it was one of the causes of the lack of pluck shown by the Chinese. This drug is opium. A great trade is done in this drug, but the Japanese will have naught to do with it. They will not let it come to Japan, nor to any land that they rule. The poor of the Japanese live for the most part on fish and rice. Japan sends out large loads of fish to other lands, salts and dries them, and gets oil from them. A large part of the folk live by fishing. The trade of Japan has now grown so great that it uses a large number of sails and steamships and sends out its goods to all parts of the world. The coal mines are a source of wealth, and gold, silver, lead, and tin have been found and worked on a small scale. The emperor who now rules Japan was born on the 3rd of November 1852 and was crowned on October 13th, 1868. In 1869, he was wed to Haruko, the child of a man who held high rank at the court of Kyoto. The emperor is tall for his race, as he stands 5 feet and 8 inches. He has a fine brow, dark eyes, a grave look, and he moves in a quick way. He shows that he has the good of his folk at heart, and he is much loved by them. The empress has a fine mind, a kind heart, and a great good sense. She does much work for the poor, and while the war with China went on, she helped to send out nurses and to scrape lint for the use of the wounded. At one time, there was a craze for the European styles of dress in Japan, and it was used at court on high days. But their own styles were well suited to them, and most have gone back to the loose robes that lent them the grace and gave them a free use of their limbs. Now that she has won peace, Japan can look for great things in the years to come. Her sons have been taught in a good school, and they will go out in the world and give proof of the sound way in which they have been trained. When the war with China was over, Japan sold the rights to Port Arthur to Russia. End of chapter 18. End of History of Japan in Words of One Syllable by Helen Ainslie Smith.